Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now the Horus Heresy is on the horizon again, and one thing I've not done on the channel before, which is spinning around in front of me today, is the Space Wolves. Now wonderfully, they're actually incredibly easy to paint. They might be the simplest of the Loyalist legions, and the method is going to be really quick. This fella here I finished about an hour and a half ahead of schedule for when I would normally finish something for a video, so that tells you something about how quick and simple this is. Now I'm going to use quite a few paints today from the Blanche Masterclass set from the Army Painter. They do have close alternatives, but they are worth having as well because, as you'll see, they give really good results. So they'll all be listed in the description below, same as always. Let's get started. So once you've got your fella assembled, first thing to do is to prime them. And here I've done this in two stages. I started off by priming them with a spray of black, and you'll see that in some of the recesses. Then what I've done is to get some uniform grey, and from roughly 45 degrees above, sprayed them at about 30 centimeters distance until I've got most of them covered in that grey. I just want a little bit of the black showing through in some areas to give us a really quick bit of shading and what have you. It's not strictly necessary. You can just prime your dude in grey. The rest of these steps will work exactly the same. It makes a relatively minor difference, but it does make a difference, so that's why I've chosen to do it that way. Now the very first thing we're going to do is to actually paint in his eyes, because this is where we're most likely to make a mess. What I'm going to use is Firey Vermillion. This is actually from the Blanche paint set. It's a very similar colour to pure red, but a bit more vibrant. You'll see I'm not bothered if I hit the top of his helmet, you see just over his brow, because we're going to paint that a separate colour later. Now that will take two coats to get a nice bright red in the recesses there, but it's worth taking the time letting the first coat dry. So if you're painting 5 or 6 of these guys at a time, this method will be even quicker. So we're now going to move on to Dryad brown and very quickly paint in any leather details. So pouches, holsters and what have you. You'll see this covers like nobody's business. Now for most of the trim, detailing and what have you, what we'll use, this is true copper. Now, it's quite similar to Balthazar gold in that it is more of a brassy color. You could also use weapon bronze here if you wanted a slightly warmer finish to this, but this I think is going to be a bit more appropriate. Now on your Mark 6 Marines, there's very, very little of this to actually do, which is wonderful. On your Mark 3 guys, they're a little bit more ornate. It is up to you if you go the route of painting in these little bits and pieces. You'll see on quite a few of the legionaries of other legions, the Mark III guys skip painting the trim on the legs and the hands, but I think it looks cool. So take the time because it is worth it. Now particularly on the trim on the shoulder pads and across the brow, you're going to want to come back and give that a second coat. In some places you'll find you don't necessarily need to, but in these larger, flatter areas that are a bit more prominent, the coverage is going to be important. I'm going to turn now to heavy metal. This is another one from the Blanche sets, and it is a wonderful dark silvery color. And with this we're going to go over all of the metal bits. You could use here gunmetal if you fancied, but I like a slightly darker gunmetal because we're not going to shade this with anything that will bring the color down very much. So better to start from a darker base coat if you can. Now something I did realize, what I have here is weapon bronze. And I probably should have done this step before painting in the metal because it would mean less tidy up. But I'm going to paint in the rounds in the magazine here. I'll also paint in the Aquila on his bolter. Now any details that are going to be black, what I'm actually going to use is Ironclad grey. Now this one is also from the Blanche set. You could just as easily use a black here if you wanted. Personally, I tend to find that if we start from a dark grey, and when we shade our miniature, those recesses are going to have a little bit of visual difference between the flatter areas on our not quite black. So it's up to you. It's really a style choice. And then, save till last, what I've got is a little bit of uniform grey, and we'll touch in any of the bits where we've made little blips, mistakes, or gone over edges we didn't want to. It's quickest if you save this step for last because you'll find you're not going to make mistakes on every miniature, and it's best to be able to tidy up once you've made all of the mistakes you're going to. Otherwise, you're consistently going back and forth between colors. So this shouldn't take too terribly long. And as you get better with your brush control, you find you actually have very little to do. Now, once you're finished with that, it's time to go ahead and shade the miniature. And what I've mixed up here, this is equal parts of Speedpaint Medium, Dark Tone, and the Warm Skin Shade from the John Blanche set. Now this is a variation on Marine Juice, which you may have heard of before. It's basically an old army painting trick from the Forge World team for getting Space Marines on the table really, really quickly. This here is a variation that's obviously using only army painter stuff, but I have done a video on mixing it up using army and medium and such before as well, which I will link to in the description. The main difference between the two is that this one I tend to find dries just a little bit darker, but on our Space Wolves, that's going to be fine. The idea here, and the reason why I've mixed my shades so much, is that I want something which is going to flow very easily, which isn't going to stain the flatter areas of the armor very much, but will still give us plenty of shading in the recesses. I want something which is dark, just off black, but is still a little bit warm without being red. That's why the mix is so specific. Anyhow, over everything, you'll find that the amount of Speedpaint Medium in here means it's very difficult to actually apply too much in any one area, which is brilliant. But yeah, once I've done with this, and I've completely drenched our Marine, I'm going to pop them in the sun somewhere, and we'll leave them to dry for about half an hour. We'll see what we get once that is done. Now, because of the amount of medium that's in here, you'll find that it does work with gravity pretty well. So you're going to get big clumps of it at the bottom of anything. So the base of his pack here, the corners of his shoulder pads are all going to be spots that are going to get quite dark very, very quickly. So if you do end up with any big, huge clumps, what you can do is grab yourself a slightly damp brush. Doesn't need to be wet, but you can wick it away from areas where you've applied or it's just collecting a little bit too much. Now you want to be fairly brave with it. Let it settle maybe a little bit more than you might think, but anywhere that it's obviously going to be too heavy, just shift it around while you've got it still wet. And once that's dried, you'll see what I mean about being able to go on quite heavy with it, because it settles and dries without really darkening down stuff too much. Particularly on the bigger, flatter areas, you'll see the medium has made sure that it's flowed away without giving us any big, funky tide marks. That's a bonus. That looks really good to me. If you wanted to, you could base them up here and just chuck them on the table as he is. Apply the transfers, and en masse, this will look fine. But from here, we are going to take it a little bit further, because it's not a huge amount of effort to make this look just a bit cooler. So what I've got here, this is wee bits of packing foam. Now you don't typically get these in Games Workshop blisters anymore, but order metal miniatures from other places, you'll get big packs like this. You could also just cannibalize a little bit from your carry case if you need to. Now you don't need very much of this at all. You see I've been trimming this down with the scissors until all I've got is this wee little nublet, and this is going to be our brush. Now it's super useful to have a funky pair of tweezers that will stay closed when there's no pressure being applied so that they can hold on to this. So dipping that little bit of foam into some Banshee brown. Now this one is another color from the John Blanche range. Let's pop them down for a second. And I'm going to dab off most of this onto a bit of kitchen towel so that I'm just leaving little speckled, uneven patterns on a surface that we dab with it. So along his armor, just little bits of this will quite quickly give us the battle damage that we want. Go light with this because it is way easier to add more if you need to. Pop too much on and you'll know about it very quickly. So concentrating on areas that are likely to see damage, so the edges of his knees, along leading parts of his shoulder pads, for example. I would recommend put your transfers on before doing this stage. As little or as much of this as you want, remembering that it is easy to go overboard very quickly. Now once you've dinged up your Space Wolf good and proper, grab some ash grey and you want to thin this down a little bit more than you normally would. and have just a tiny amount of it on your brush at a time. What we'll do is go to some of the larger patches of that battle damage. I like to start on the upper edges, just making it look as though that damage is caught in a particular way. Really just with a wee tickle of the brush, especially along areas like this, helping to find the shape a little of that damage. Now, you don't need to do this everywhere. It'll be quite prominent where you do. So take your time, and same as with the initial stuff. It's easy to add too much, so go slow. See what you like the look of first. Now that is a method which will take a bit of practice because it does rely on quite precise brush control. But it is a good method to actually practice that, because if you make any mistakes, you can normally just quickly wipe it off with your finger, and it's not going to upset the finish that you've got at all. Now what I'm going to do, before I highlight the metal, is actually go and take them outside and hit them with a varnish. Reason being, I'm going to use a matte varnish, and if I put that over the top of his highlights, they aren't going to shine as much. So in a second, he is suddenly going to be not so shiny. And there you can see, I think, that varnishing isn't just for protecting your miniatures. Changing up the finish lets you do quite some interesting things with it. So from the back, there we go. What I'm going to do is grab some plate mail metal, and I'm going to highlight, funnily enough, the silvery metallic bits. But what I'll also do is, very, very similarly to how we did the chipping on his armor, on the black parts of his gun, what I'm going to do is just dot in a few tiny little scratches. You want this to be as uneven and as ragged as you can. I think there might be a little bit much on my brush there. But oh well, that's better. So as much as possible, just little flicky bits and uneven scratches to highlight the black. And you can do the same with the silver as well. And you can do the same thing on the brassy parts with here, true brass. Now, this is a wonderful, very, very light, just off silver color. So mind how much of this you put on, otherwise your fella is going to turn basically silver very, very quickly. But a little bit of this at corners and edges of the brassy detail, oh, it's wonderful. For the most part, you'll find you'll be able to just use the edge of your brush to catch these fine details. Now we're cooking. I love how that looks. Now the final thing that I'm going to do with the miniature, and this is purely in the realm of if you want to, I have here some fur brown, and I'm going to tick it along just the very edges of some of these details on his holster to give this a bit more depth. Once I'm done with this, what I'm going to do is base him, and I'll pop the recipe for that in the description. What I'd recommend is, because your color scheme here is quite neutral, quite flat, pick something on your base which will add to the miniature, where you don't have to paint any extra colors on the figure itself. So I'm going to do a bit of brown and a little bit of green, I think. You know, some simple green tufts will probably add quite a bit here. But let's get a look at what he looks like once I'm satisfied with all of this. And so, there at last, our Space Wolf is complete. Now a common question is, how am I going to get that little bit of dust onto the legs while I'm doing the basing? And the answer is actually really simple. When you're dry brushing the sand or the texture paint, whatever it is that you've put on the base itself, as you start running out of paint on your brush, just flick it up his legs a little bit. And the colors for those are in the description too, what I've used there for that. It's really just a case, same as with all dry brushing, make sure that you've got very little on your brush, because it's easy to add more, but taking it off is a little bit more difficult. Now I've really enjoyed painting this guy, which always surprises me. I feel as though, oh no, another Space Marine, it's going to be boring. And then I have an absolute blast doing it, so maybe the universe is trying to tell me something. Anyhow, hopefully something there was interesting to you. And as always, thank you very much goes to Exit 23 Games for all of the light and sound equipment, and all of my wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my most gorgeous producers who are showing up on screen now. Your support is what keeps this channel spinning, folks. Thank you so much. Now, any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Blue Sky and Instagram are both linked there too. So, thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.